Halloween in Cedarville, Kentucky was always a community event. Every year the streets came alive with carved pumpkins glowing on porches, paper ghosts dangling from trees, and children rehearsing their trick-or-treat chants. But in 2014, what began as a festive autumn morning quickly turned into a chilling mystery that silenced the laughter and left an entire town paralyzed with fear. The story begins with a young mother named Hannah Lowell. At 25, Hannah was known for her quiet determination and her devotion to her little boy, 3-year-old Mason. Friends described her as soft-spoken, reliable, the kind of person who never let anyone down. Halloween had always been her favorite holiday, a chance to create magical memories for Mason. That year she had decorated her small house from top to bottom, paper bats taped to the walls, orange lights strung across the porch, and a row of carved pumpkins that Mason helped scoop out with his tiny hands. On the night of October 30th, Hannah had gone through the usual routine. She bathed Mason, tucked him into bed, and spoke on the phone with her mother, Margaret, about how excited the boy was for his Spider-Man costume. She also texted her boyfriend, Elliot Kane, wishing him good night. For Elliot, those words carried a significance he hadn't shared with anyone yet. He had been planning to propose that weekend, and he thought Halloween would be the perfect time. Mason dressed as Spider-Man, Hannah smiling on the porch, the ring hidden in a candy bucket. But no one could have known that those simple exchanges, the phone call to her mother, the brief goodnight text, would be the last time anyone ever heard from her alive. When morning came, the porch light at Hannah's house was still on. That detail would later stand out to investigators, but at the time it seemed like nothing more than a forgotten switch. At around 7 a.m., Caleb Hensley, her stepfather by her mother's remarriage, knocked on the door. Caleb was a familiar face in Hannah's home, often trusted with small errands and with looking after Mason. According to his account, Hannah was in the bathroom getting ready for work. She asked him to turn down the heat before leaving, and he lay down on the couch to rest while Mason was still asleep in his bedroom. By 8 o'clock, Mason woke up to find his mother gone. Caleb told the boy she had already left for work. He dressed Mason, drove him to his father's home across town, and went about his day as if nothing unusual had happened. But something was very wrong. At the retail store where Hannah worked as a manager, her absence was noted immediately. She was responsible for opening the shop, handling the registers, and greeting the staff at the start of their shift. For her not to show up or even call in was unimaginable. Colleagues tried calling her cell phone. It rang once, then went silent. Soon the line was unreachable, as if the phone had been turned off or discarded. One of her co-workers grew concerned enough to drive out to her house. He knocked on the door, but no one answered. Looking through the window, he saw the decorations, the kitchen table with Hannah's purse lying open, but no sign of her. He circled around back and noticed something odd. Her car, a silver sedan, was missing from its usual spot in the driveway. Later, he found it parked near a small bar a short distance from the trailer park. Hannah had never parked there before. Visiting a bar on Halloween morning made no sense, especially when she was supposed to be opening the store. The co-worker reported what he found to Margaret and Caleb. Within hours, family members and neighbors were gathering outside Hannah's home, speculating, worrying, searching for explanations. Maybe she had left suddenly for an errand. Maybe there had been a medical emergency. But none of the theories held. Her purse was inside, her car had been moved, her phone was silent. Something had happened, and it was growing clear that she hadn't left voluntarily. By noon, Margaret called the Cedar County Sheriff's Department. At first, the police response was subdued. Hannah was an adult, 25 years old, and legally entitled to leave on her own. Officers suggested waiting, assuming she might return later that day. They decided not to launch an immediate search. Instead, they planned to reevaluate around 4:30 p.m., giving her time to come back on her own. It was a decision that would later be criticized. Those crucial hours, when evidence was still fresh, when neighbors might have remembered seeing something, when surveillance cameras might still have recorded useful footage, were lost. By late afternoon, the urgency could no longer be ignored. Hannah had not returned. Worse, she had failed to pick up Mason for trick-or-treating, something she had promised him for weeks. That single fact shifted the case instantly from a routine missing adult file to a suspicious disappearance. Hannah would never abandon her son. Detectives began their work, securing a search warrant for her home and car, interviewing her closest contacts, piecing together the last hours of her life. On the surface, the picture was unsettlingly blank. No signs of forced entry. No evidence of a struggle in the house. Just a purse on the table, decorations hanging outside, and silence where a young mother should have been preparing candy for neighborhood children. As word spread, fear gripped Cedarville. Neighbors locked their doors, kept their children inside, and watched reporters swarm the small town. The idea that a woman could vanish from her own home in broad daylight, without witnesses, was unthinkable. People whispered theories: an abduction, a runaway case, even a sudden accident. But those who knew Hannah, her co-workers, her family, her friends, were certain. She hadn't left by choice. For them, the question was immediate and terrifying: who took Hannah Lowell and why? The police soon focused on the people closest to her. Statistically, that's where the answers usually lie. Her boyfriend, her ex-partner, her family members. Each of them would come under scrutiny. But among those names, one stood out, if only because he was the last person to see her alive. Her stepfather, Caleb Hensley. At that point, no one outside law enforcement suspected him. To neighbors, he was still the kind pastor who had once spoken gently from the pulpit. To Margaret, he was a companion who had helped her rebuild her life after loss. To Mason, he was the grandfather figure who drove him to daycare. But as the hours turned into days, investigators would peel back the carefully constructed layers of Caleb's identity. What they uncovered would shock not only Hannah's family but the entire state. The disappearance of a young woman on Halloween morning would reveal a man who had been hiding in plain sight. A man with a history of violence, a mask of piety, and a darkness no one had dared imagine. To understand the mystery of Hannah Lowell's disappearance, investigators needed to step back and piece together who she was, the life she lived, and the people who orbited closest around her. Cases like this rarely exist in a vacuum. They are built from relationships, histories, and the quiet rhythms of daily life. And sometimes, it is within those very details that the truth begins to surface. Hannah Lowell had been born and raised in the farmland stretches just outside of Cedarville, Kentucky. The youngest of 4 siblings, she grew up in a modest household where work and faith were both seen as cornerstones of life. Her father, Robert Lowell, was a horse trainer, known locally for helping children with riding lessons and for volunteering at county fairs. Her mother, Margaret, organized small charity drives through the local church. From the beginning, Hannah absorbed this sense of care and responsibility. She was not the loudest voice in a room, nor the kind of person who sought attention. Friends recalled her as steady, gentle, and quietly determined. When her father passed away after a long illness during her teenage years, Hannah shouldered the grief alongside her mother, becoming a source of comfort for her siblings. That experience, people would later say, hardened her resolve to be dependable. She didn't waver when life grew difficult. After high school, Hannah briefly attended cosmetology school, drawn to the art of making others feel confident and cared for. She was talented, but when she had her son, Mason, at the age of 22, her priorities shifted. Long salon hours didn't fit with raising a toddler. So she found work at a retail store in Cedarville, climbing quickly to a managerial role. Supervisors described her as punctual, organized, and someone you could trust with a key to the store. Her life revolved around 2 things: Mason and stability. The boy was her anchor. She loved him fiercely, documenting his milestones in scrapbooks, celebrating each holiday with extra effort, and taking photos of him in every costume from cowboy to dinosaur. Halloween 2014 was special because it would be Mason's first year actually walking from door to door. Hannah had gone all out, covering her yard in webs, scarecrows, and string lights. She wanted it to be a day her son would never forget. On the personal front, Hannah's love life had not been smooth. Mason's father, Tyler Grant, was a high school boyfriend. Their relationship ended amicably when they realized they weren't meant to be long-term partners, but they continued to co-parent responsibly. Tyler remained in Mason's life, a presence Hannah respected and valued. In 2013, Hannah began dating Elliot Kane, a local engineer. Unlike her youthful relationship with Tyler, her bond with Elliot was rooted in maturity and shared vision. Elliot didn't just accept Mason, he embraced him. He played ball with the boy in the yard, built Lego towers with him on the living room floor, and attended school events even though he wasn't technically family. By the fall of 2014, Elliot had quietly saved for an engagement ring, planning to propose on Halloween. For him, the day wasn't just about candy or costumes. It was going to mark the beginning of a new chapter. Hannah's family life seemed to be settling into balance. Her mother, Margaret, who had endured the loss of her husband years earlier, found companionship in a man named Caleb Hensley. He was older, with a calm voice and a reputation as a man of faith. Once a pastor at a small church, Caleb presented himself as humble and steady, the kind of man who opened doors, carried groceries, and led prayers at family dinners. Margaret leaned on him during her lonelier years, grateful for his stability. Soon, Caleb became a fixture in both Margaret's and Hannah's lives. He would cook dinner for the family, mow the lawn when Hannah was overwhelmed, and offer to watch Mason whenever she needed to work late. To outsiders, he seemed almost too good to be true, a father figure stepping into the gap left by Robert's passing. And yet, when investigators interviewed those who knew Hannah best, they began to hear faint whispers that not everything was as seamless as it appeared. Co-workers remembered that Hannah sometimes mentioned Caleb showing up at her home unannounced. He would linger near her workplace, ask personal questions, or comment on her appearance in ways that made her uncomfortable. It wasn't enough for her to file a complaint or openly confront him. Hannah was polite and Caleb was her mother's partner, but the unease was real. She once admitted to a friend that she didn't know what to make of his attention, calling it strange, but maybe just him being overly friendly. What Hannah didn't know, what almost no one in Cedarville knew, was that Caleb's story was not one of redemption, but of concealment. He had carefully rewritten his past, telling Margaret and their church community that his life had once been sidetracked by a bad relationship with a troubled woman, and that faith had brought him back to the right path. Few questioned him. His calm demeanor and willingness to lend a hand made it easy to believe his story. But buried in old records far from Cedarville was another truth. A criminal history stretching back decades, involving violent encounters with women. None of that had ever been disclosed to Margaret or to the congregation that welcomed him. To Hannah, however, Caleb was simply her mother's partner. A man she tolerated, sometimes appreciated when he helped with Mason, sometimes avoided when he crossed invisible lines. She had no reason to imagine that the man who carved pumpkins with her son could also harbor something far more sinister. As investigators charted Hannah's circle, her colleagues, her family, her partners, they saw a picture forming. Here was a woman living a modest but full life, balancing work, motherhood, and love. Her son adored her, her boyfriend cherished her, her community respected her. She had no enemies, no debts, no high-risk lifestyle that would make her a target. Except for one thing, the presence of Caleb Hensley. A man whose role in her life was both ordinary and yet, just out of the corner of the eye, unsettling. It was this context that made her disappearance all the more confounding. Hannah Lowell was not the kind of person to walk away. She had responsibilities, routines, and deep attachments. When she vanished, the foundation of her life collapsed in an instant. And as police prepared to dig deeper into her past and her relationships, the facade that Caleb had built over decades would begin to crack, exposing a darkness no one in Cedarville had imagined was living right among them. On the morning of October 31, 2014, the rhythms of Cedarville unfolded as usual. Children hurried off to school dressed in costumes under their jackets, neighbors placed final decorations on their porches, and the air carried the scent of fallen leaves mixed with pumpkin spice. For many, it was a day of joy and tradition. But inside the Lowell home, silence had already replaced laughter. By 9 a.m., Hannah's absence at the retail store where she worked was impossible to ignore. She wasn't just another employee, she was the one who opened the shop, balanced the registers, and made sure the shelves were stocked for the morning rush. Her punctuality was almost legendary. If she said she would be there at 8, she was there at 7:59. So when the doors stayed locked and customers began to gather outside, her co-workers grew uneasy. They tried calling her phone. At first it rang once. Then, after several attempts, it went straight to voicemail. To those who knew her, the sudden silence was more alarming than the locked doors. Hannah was always reachable, even if just by text. By mid-morning, one of the assistant managers, a man named Kelly Rhodes, decided to drive out to her house. He knew Hannah lived only a few miles away in a modest rental on the edge of town, near the trailer park where her mother and stepfather stayed. Kelly pulled into the gravel driveway expecting to find her car. Instead, the spot was empty. He knocked on the door. No answer. Peering through the front window, he saw the familiar decorations, the cobwebs, the pumpkins Mason had helped carve, but the house inside looked still, untouched. On the kitchen table, just visible through the lace curtains, sat Hannah's purse. For Kelly, that was the first red flag. She never went anywhere without it. Circling around the property, he noticed something else odd. Hannah's silver sedan wasn't just missing from the driveway, it was parked down the road near Ryder's Bar, a place she never visited, certainly not at 9 in the morning. Kelly stepped inside the bar, asked if anyone had seen her. The bartender shook his head, though he had noticed the car sitting there since early morning. Puzzled and increasingly anxious, Kelly drove back to the store, reported what he'd found, and called Hannah's mother, Margaret. Within an hour, Margaret and Caleb were at the house, rattling the doorknob, calling her name, trying to make sense of it all. Margaret's voice trembled as she left message after message on Hannah's phone. "Call me back, honey. Just let me know you're okay." Each call went unanswered. Caleb, meanwhile, told neighbors gathering outside that he had dropped Mason off at Tyler's earlier, that Hannah had been in the bathroom when he left. His account seemed rehearsed, almost too detailed in some places and vague in others. By noon, Margaret dialed the Cedar County Sheriff's Department. The response was lukewarm at best. Missing adult cases rarely triggered immediate action, especially when there was no evidence of foul play. Officers explained that Hannah could have left on her own. Maybe she needed space. Maybe she was with a friend. They would check back in a few hours. That explanation might have satisfied the law on paper, but it didn't satisfy Hannah's family. They knew her routines, her responsibilities. She had promised Mason she would take him trick-or-treating. She had left her purse behind. And she never, ever left without telling her mother where she was going. The community began to mobilize even before the sheriff's deputies did. Friends called Hannah's phone again and again, hoping for a ring. Others spread word on social media. Young mother missing in Cedarville. Last seen at her home. Please contact if you've heard from her. Neighbors walked through the trailer park, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen her car leaving that morning. As hours ticked by, the small-town atmosphere changed. Cedarville wasn't used to danger. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where gossip revolved around church bake sales and high school football games. For a woman to vanish from her own home in broad daylight, without witnesses, without signs of struggle, was unthinkable. Parents held their children a little closer that day. Porch lights flickered on early, not for trick-or-treaters but out of fear. At around 4:30 p.m., after Hannah still hadn't returned, law enforcement officially elevated the case to a suspicious disappearance. A warrant was issued to search her home and vehicle. By then, precious hours had already slipped away. Inside the house, investigators found little to explain her absence. The purse on the table. Halloween decorations in place. Mason's toys scattered in the living room. No overturned furniture, no bloodstains, no shattered glass. It looked like she had simply stepped out the door and vanished. But investigators knew appearances could be deceiving. The absence of obvious signs didn't mean the absence of crime, it meant someone had been careful. They also inspected her car. The interior was strangely clean, as if someone had recently wiped it down. No fingerprints on the steering wheel, no receipts or notes to give clues about her movements. It was the kind of emptiness that investigators feared most, the absence of information where there should have been some. Meanwhile, Margaret was unraveling. For her, the possibility that Hannah had chosen to leave was unthinkable. She clung to Caleb for support, repeating the same words to anyone who would listen. She wouldn't leave Mason. She just wouldn't. Caleb, for his part, echoed her concern, telling deputies how he had last seen Hannah, how ordinary that morning had been. He offered his version freely, perhaps too freely, as though eager to control the narrative. Detectives began the standard process, looking into the men in Hannah's life. Elliot was questioned first. He explained their last text conversation, his plans to propose, his love for Hannah. His alibi was airtight. Phone records showed he had been at home all night. Tyler, Mason's father, was next. He admitted seeing Caleb that morning when Mason was dropped off, but nothing seemed unusual. Surveillance footage from his workplace confirmed his presence all day. That left one person, Caleb. At first, there was nothing solid against him. Just the unsettling detail that he had been the last to see her. But when detectives looked closer, tiny cracks began to appear. The scratches on his hands. The bruise on his nose. The way he repeated himself as if trying to convince not just them but himself. Neighbors also began to whisper. They remembered seeing Caleb at Ryder's bar earlier that morning, asking if anyone had spotted Hannah. Why, they wondered, would he be at a bar at 9 a.m.? Why would he be looking for her there? Piece by piece, suspicion started to build. The wholesome image Caleb had crafted began to wobble under scrutiny. His history, what little people knew of it, was vague. His explanations thin. And yet, to Margaret and much of the community, he was still the gentle pastor who prayed before meals and carried groceries for widows. For investigators, though, the picture was shifting. The disappearance of Hannah Lowell wasn't random, wasn't voluntary. It was deliberate. And the man who had inserted himself into her family, who had placed himself so close to her and her son, was no longer just a concerned stepfather. He was a potential suspect. When a young woman disappears without a trace, investigators know the first place to look is within her immediate circle. In Cedarville, that meant Hannah's boyfriend, her ex-partner, her mother, and the man who now lived in her mother's home. Caleb Hensley. Each had ties to her, each had opportunity. But the closer detectives looked, the more the circle began to tighten. The first to sit across from detectives was Elliot Kane, Hannah's boyfriend. He came to the sheriff's office willingly, a worn baseball cap in his hands, eyes rimmed red from lack of sleep. He explained that his last contact with Hannah was a simple text the night before, "Good night." For Elliot that was normal. Hannah often went to bed early after putting Mason down. He hadn't thought twice about the silence that followed. Detectives pressed him. Had there been arguments? Had Hannah seemed distant? Elliot shook his head firmly. On the contrary, he said their relationship had never been stronger. He even admitted something deeply personal. He had been saving for a ring, planning to propose to her that weekend. His voice cracked when he said it, but the statement carried weight. Men don't usually volunteer something that intimate if they are hiding guilt. Phone records backed him up. His cell had ping towers near his home all night. Surveillance from a nearby gas station showed him buying groceries late in the evening, then returning home. His alibi was solid. Next came Tyler Grant, Mason's father. As Hannah's high school sweetheart and co-parent, Tyler was another natural suspect. Statistically, ex-partners often play roles in cases of disappearance. But Tyler's demeanor was calm, almost weary. He admitted he had seen Caleb that morning, dropping off Mason around 8:30. Nothing had seemed unusual. Tyler himself had clocked into work shortly after, with security footage confirming his presence at the auto shop where he worked until evening. Detectives reviewed custody arrangements, looked for tension between Tyler and Hannah. There was none. Their relationship, by all accounts, was practical and stable. They spoke only about Mason, and Tyler still attended family events when invited. The picture of a jealous ex simply didn't fit. That left one name looming larger: Caleb Hensley. Caleb was the last person confirmed to have seen Hannah. He admitted being at her home that morning, admitted dropping Mason off at Tyler's. But when detectives asked about what happened inside the house, the cracks began to show. He claimed Hannah had been in the bathroom when he arrived, her voice calling out for him to adjust the thermostat before he left. But he couldn't say whether she left before or after him. He repeated the detail again and again as if anchoring himself to a story. She was in the bathroom. She told me to turn down the heat. That's all I know. Detectives noted his face, scratches on his hands, a dark bruise across the bridge of his nose. Caleb explained them away casually. I was fixing a shelf in my trailer. It fell on me. You can see the spot where it happened. His eagerness to provide explanations struck investigators as rehearsed. Then there was his behavior. Caleb was too helpful, too insistent on his innocence. He volunteered to speak to the congregation about Hannah's disappearance, urged deputies to search everywhere, and kept repeating how heartbroken Margaret was. His language focused less on Hannah herself and more on how he appeared to others. Behind the scenes, detectives began digging into Caleb's background. What they found unsettled them. The official records were fragmented, with unexplained gaps. Former addresses that didn't match up. Jobs held briefly, then abandoned. And then, tucked into archived files, something darker. Criminal charges from decades earlier in another county. Charges tied to violence against women. The revelation reframed the entire investigation. Detectives returned to Hannah's friends and co-workers, asking specific questions about Caleb. That's when subtle stories surfaced. One colleague remembered Hannah confiding that Caleb sometimes lingered too long near her register at the store. Another recalled Hannah saying he once complimented her appearance in a way that felt odd. None of it was explicit harassment, but there was a pattern. Caleb inserting himself into Hannah's life in ways that made her uneasy. Elliot, too, provided insight. He admitted Caleb often made comments about Hannah's looks, especially after she had gotten a cosmetic procedure done earlier that year. He'd bring it up all the time, Elliot said. Like he couldn't stop noticing her. It didn't feel like how a stepfather should act. Even Caleb's own sister, when interviewed, described hearing him complain about Hannah. He resented that she visited less often once she started dating Elliot. He said she was becoming ungrateful, that she no longer appreciated everything he did for her. At the time, his sister thought it was just frustration, nothing more. But in the light of Hannah's disappearance, those words felt chilling. With each new piece of testimony, suspicion tightened around Caleb. Yet suspicion alone was not enough. Investigators needed evidence, something physical, something undeniable. So they asked Caleb to take a polygraph test. At first he refused. I've got nothing to prove, he said. But under pressure from Margaret, he eventually agreed. On the drive to the neighboring city where the test would be administered, he surprised detectives by bringing up his past himself. He admitted he had a conviction years ago, but claimed it was exaggerated, involving a woman on drugs who had misunderstood a situation. He insisted he had turned his life around since then. Detectives listened, but their skepticism deepened. If it was so minor, why had he hidden it from Margaret? Why had he never told his church? And why did his version of events sound so different from what the archived records showed? At the same time, residents of Cedarville began whispering. The man they once saw as a devoted pastor now appeared in a different light. They remembered small details. Him showing up at unusual hours, asking questions about Hannah, frequenting the bar that morning. The circle of suspicion was closing. Elliot had been cleared. Tyler had been cleared. That left Caleb, the man who lived just across the street from Hannah, who moved easily in and out of her home, who had her trust, and who had both the access and opportunity to make her vanish. For investigators, one haunting question lingered. If Caleb was capable of hiding one past, what else had he hidden? And what, exactly, had happened inside Hannah's home on Halloween morning? For days, suspicion hovered over Caleb Hensley like a storm cloud. On the surface, he was still the same man the town of Cedarville thought they knew. A pastor who prayed with the sick, a neighbor who mowed lawns, a partner who had brought companionship to a grieving widow. But beneath that carefully polished image, investigators were uncovering fragments of a darker story. It began with a background check. At first, the records came back oddly thin. A few job listings, addresses across different counties, a marriage that ended in divorce years earlier. There were gaps, long stretches of time with no documented employment or residence. To trained investigators, those gaps were as telling as evidence itself. They hinted at something deliberately erased, something not meant to be found. Digging deeper, detectives requested archived court records from other jurisdictions. That's when the mask began to slip. In 1982, more than 30 years before Hannah's disappearance, a 17-year-old girl named Teresa Miller had reported being attacked in her neighbor's basement. According to her statement, she had been invited over to see a model racetrack, a harmless request, or so she thought. Once inside, Caleb, then 23, locked the door. He stabbed her near the shoulder and tried to strangle her with his bare hands. Teresa somehow managed to fight free and escape, staggering into the street with blood on her shirt. When police arrived, she told them something chilling. Caleb had whispered during the attack that this wasn't the first time. He was arrested and charged with attempted homicide. Convicted, he received a sentence of 5 to 10 years. But he served only 2. A plea deal citing inadequate legal defense and a promise of psychiatric treatment won him early release. To the system, he appeared rehabilitated, cooperative. To Teresa, he was a nightmare who had slipped through the cracks. For several years after, Caleb stayed low. He married, had children, worked odd jobs in warehouses and factories. By the mid-1990s, he was employed at an industrial laundry facility. That was when another name entered the record: Vicky Sanders, a 26-year-old co-worker. Vicky was last seen in the summer of 1996 leaving a store parking lot with Caleb. They had been having a secret affair, one she confided to friends was complicated and volatile. When she didn't come home that night, her family reported her missing. Caleb told police he had dropped her off near her home, that he couldn't remember the details of their time together. 6 weeks later, her decomposed body was found near a wooded area outside town. A piece of cloth was tied tightly around her neck. The cause of death was consistent with strangulation, but too much time had passed for a definitive ruling. Caleb eventually accepted a plea deal, admitting to involuntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to 8 to 15 years. The court noted his prior conviction, but parole opportunities remained open. While in prison, Caleb painted a picture of remorse. He joined religious study groups, read scripture, spent hours in the chapel. He told prison psychologists about his dark thoughts, fantasies of hurting women, even a disturbing attraction to lifeless bodies. Yet, instead of flagging him as a dangerous offender, the system marked him as a man on the path to reform. By 2007, Caleb was free again. He obtained minister credentials through a small church, told those around him a carefully edited version of his past. According to him, he had once been involved with a troubled woman, someone addicted to drugs who had tragically died. He claimed panic had led him to make mistakes, but faith had saved him. That story was repeated often enough that it began to sound like truth. Congregations welcomed him, community members trusted him, and Margaret, lonely after her husband's death, accepted his companionship without hesitation. To most people in Cedarville, Caleb was a man reborn. But to detectives reviewing the full file, he was something else entirely. A repeat offender with a pattern stretching back decades, a man who slipped past accountability again and again. When investigators confronted Margaret with these revelations, she was devastated. She had never known. He had never told her. To her, Caleb was the man who prayed at her husband's funeral, who fixed her porch steps, who helped tuck Mason into bed when Hannah was tired. She wept as detectives explained that the man she lived with had once confessed to fantasies that made hardened prison guards uneasy. Meanwhile, Caleb himself seemed to sense the walls closing in. His behavior shifted. Where before he had been overly eager to cooperate, now he grew defensive. He insisted his past had nothing to do with Hannah's disappearance. He told detectives, "That was a lifetime ago. I am not that man anymore." But his words rang hollow. The more he denied, the more the evidence suggested otherwise. Community members also began to remember moments that now felt sinister. A bartender recalled Caleb coming in on Halloween morning, asking if anyone had seen Hannah. Odd, since at that time no one outside her workplace even knew she was missing. A neighbor remembered him circling the trailer park that day, his face pale, his hands fidgeting. The wholesome pastor image crumbled quickly. Once people heard of his past, the trust evaporated. Parishioners who had once prayed with him now looked at him with suspicion. Parents who had let their children sit on his porch now wondered what danger they had unknowingly allowed near their homes. For detectives, one truth became clear. Caleb wasn't simply a man with a checkered past. He was a predator who had hidden behind faith, respectability, and community ties. And Hannah Lowell had been his latest victim. The next step was crucial, finding evidence solid enough to tie him directly to her disappearance. Witness statements and old records were not enough. They needed something physical, undeniable. So, armed with a search warrant, investigators descended on Caleb's trailer and his pickup truck. What they discovered inside would erase any remaining doubts and reveal the chilling reality of what had happened to Hannah Lowell. By the time investigators had traced Caleb Hensley's criminal history, suspicion was no longer enough. They needed something tangible, physical evidence to connect him to Hannah's disappearance. Testimonies, rumors, even his own admissions about a conviction decades earlier, would not be sufficient to hold him in court. The search for truth had to move from words to objects, from stories to facts. On the evening of November 2, 2014, a judge signed a warrant authorizing detectives to search Caleb's trailer and his pickup truck. The air was heavy as officers assembled outside his modest home at the edge of Cedarville. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains as the convoy of patrol cars rolled in, their flashing lights breaking the calm of the small community. For many, it was the first time they realized the man they once trusted might be hiding something monstrous. The search began with Caleb's vehicle. His old Ford pickup, parked neatly in front of the trailer, seemed ordinary at first glance. The cab smelled faintly of cleaning agents, too sharp, too recent. When investigators shined their flashlights across the seats, they noticed faint reddish-brown stains absorbed into the fabric. Quick field tests hinted at blood. Then came the items tucked behind the driver's seat, a heavy-duty black contractor bag containing a collection of things that froze the room in silence. Inside were plastic zip ties, a pack of heavy-duty trash bags, a rubber mallet with faint smears of discoloration, and disturbingly several pieces of women's clothing far too small to belong to Caleb's fiancée Margaret. One item in particular stood out, a delicate necklace with a broken clasp. Friends confirmed Hannah was rarely seen without hers. In the glove compartment, detectives found a pair of latex gloves, rolled tight and discarded, their fingertips smeared faintly red. To seasoned investigators, the pattern was obvious. These weren't random items tossed into a truck. They were tools of control, violence, and disposal. Moving into Caleb's trailer, the discoveries continued. His kitchen smelled faintly of bleach, though Margaret swore she hadn't cleaned in days. In the bathroom, officers collected damp towels stained with what appeared to be diluted blood. Near the sink, a bottle of industrial-strength cleaner sat half-empty. In a storage closet, wrapped in a rag, they found the same mallet type as the one from the truck, this one with dark stains caked near the head. Forensic teams swabbed the surface, confident they would confirm traces of Hannah's DNA. The deeper the search went, the harder it became to imagine Caleb explaining any of it away. And yet he tried. When detectives confronted him with the items, he shrugged. The clothes, he claimed, must have been left behind from a church donation drive. The mallet was for repairs around the trailer. The blood, he suggested it came from a cut on his hand. His answers were shallow, collapsing under the weight of the evidence piling in front of him. One detail was especially damning. Inside a small box in his bedroom drawer, investigators discovered Hannah's driver's license. It had been carefully tucked away between old receipts and folded cash. There was no explanation for why he would have it. Margaret gasped when she saw it. She had believed Caleb's protests of innocence, but now she couldn't reconcile the man in front of her with the man who had hidden her daughter's belongings in his home. The forensic lab worked quickly. Within days, results confirmed what detectives already suspected. The blood on the mallet matched Hannah's DNA. The stains on the towels were hers as well. Fibers from her clothing were found in the trash bags. Everything pointed to a violent confrontation that ended in her death. With the evidence secured, investigators prepared for another round of interrogation. This time the tone was different. No more polite questions, no more patient listening to Caleb's rehearsed explanations. The detectives laid each piece on the table in front of him. The necklace, the mallet, the photos of blood patterns. At first, Caleb leaned back in his chair trying to project calm. He repeated the same lines, "I don't know what happened. I didn't hurt her. You're mistaken." But as the hours dragged on, his composure began to crack. The weight of silence pressed down, broken only by the scrape of pens against paper and the steady hum of the overhead light. Detectives shifted tactics. They spoke not of Hannah but of Margaret and Mason. They described how Margaret deserved the truth, how Mason might grow up never knowing what became of his mother. They painted vivid images of a body left undiscovered, decomposing in the woods, leaving loved ones with endless questions. The strategy worked. Caleb's mask of composure faltered. His hands shook as he asked for water. At one point he requested to make a phone call. The late-night conversation with Margaret was brief, just a choked apology, no explanations. When he hung up, his face was ashen. Returning to the table, Caleb finally spoke the words detectives had been waiting for. "I'll tell you what happened. But I don't want the death penalty. I'll take life. Just no death." And then, piece by piece, the truth spilled out. Caleb described the night of October 30th in chilling detail. He had been drinking, browsing disturbing websites, his mind racing. At around 2 in the morning, he left his own home and walked across the dark street to Hannah's. He knew she often left the back door unlocked. Inside he found her asleep. When she stirred at the sound of his steps, he panicked, or perhaps acted exactly as he had planned. He struck her with the rubber mallet. She woke enough to recognize him, whispering his name. That made him panic further. He looped a plastic zip tie around her neck and pulled until her breathing stopped. Afterward, he cleaned what he could, bundled her body in plastic and moved her to his truck. He dumped her belongings in a dumpster, parked her car near Ryder's Bar to mislead investigators, and drove to a ravine outside town to dispose of her body. Then he returned home, slept a few hours, and in the morning carried out the routine of dropping Mason off at Tyler's house, calm, collected as if nothing had happened. His confession aligned with every piece of evidence investigators had found. The stains, the necklace, the trash bags, all of it. It was the missing link, the one thing that transformed suspicion into certainty. For Margaret, the revelations were unbearable. She had lost her daughter and learned that the man she shared her home with had been living a double life, a predator disguised as a pastor. For Elliot, the ring he had hidden in his drawer became a painful reminder of the future that would never come. And for Mason, too young to understand, the loss of his mother would echo in ways he would only grasp years later. The case that began with a locked door, an empty driveway, and a silent phone had reached its devastating truth. Hannah Lowell was gone. And the man responsible was the very one who had eaten dinner at her table, who had bowed his head in prayer beside her family, who had built his entire identity on a lie. By the time Caleb Hensley confessed, there was no longer a mystery about what had happened to Hannah Lowell. The physical evidence, his own words, and the grim discovery of her remains left nothing in question. What remained was the legal process, the slow machinery of justice turning against the man who had lived for years as Cedarville's model citizen. The courtroom was small, the kind of place where county traffic disputes were usually heard, not murder cases. But in late 2014, every bench was filled. Reporters lined the back row, locals whispered prayers, and Hannah's family sat rigid, staring forward. Her mother Margaret, still stunned by the revelation that her partner was the killer, didn't attend every session. When she did, she sat with her head bowed, hands clenched, unable to look at Caleb. The prosecution's case was straightforward. They presented the necklace recovered from Caleb's truck, the mallet bearing Hannah's blood, the towel stained with DNA in his trailer, and his own signed confession. Witnesses filled in the context. Elliot describing his last conversation with Hannah, Tyler recounting the morning Mason was dropped off, co-workers speaking about Hannah's unease with Caleb's attention. Piece by piece they painted the image of a predator hiding in plain sight. The defense had little room to maneuver. Their strategy was to humanize Caleb, portraying him as a man tormented by alcoholism and unresolved mental health struggles, a man who had fallen off a path of redemption. They argued that his confession, while horrifying, demonstrated remorse and responsibility. But even the most sympathetic narrative couldn't erase his prior convictions or the brutality of Hannah's final moments. When Caleb himself spoke, it was with a calmness that unsettled many. He admitted to killing Hannah but denied it had been premeditated. He called it a terrible mistake, a night of weakness. He said he had no intention of hurting her, that he only lost control. But to the jury, his words echoed those he had used in past cases. Excuses that had bought him leniency before, excuses that allowed him to re-enter society and claim another victim. The judge was clear: some individuals, through their actions, forfeit the privilege of living among others. Mr. Hensley, you are one of them. The sentence was severe, 65 to 90 years in prison, effectively a life sentence given Caleb's age. He would never again walk free, never again be able to insert himself into a family's trust. The court's decision brought a measure of relief but not closure. For Hannah's family, the pain was immeasurable. Elliot never got to propose, never got to see Hannah wear the ring he had bought. He spoke outside the courthouse, his voice shaking, saying, "She was my future, and now my future is gone." Tyler faced the impossible task of raising Mason without his mother. He shielded the boy from courtrooms and headlines, trying to preserve his innocence a little longer. Margaret, meanwhile, lived with a double grief: the loss of her daughter, and the realization that the man she had trusted had betrayed her in the most unimaginable way. For the community of Cedarville, the trial shattered illusions. Neighbors who had once praised Caleb's kindness now replayed old memories, questioning what they had missed. Parishioners dismantled the small church he had led, its pews collecting dust as congregants left, unable to pray in a place that had harbored a murderer. The town's sense of safety, once taken for granted, was gone. Parents no longer let children wander freely, doors were locked at night, and trust became a rarer currency. But the story didn't end in the courtroom. Less than a year into his sentence, in August 2015, corrections officers at the state penitentiary found Caleb lifeless in his cell. He had hanged himself with a bedsheet. There was no note, no explanation, just silence. His death triggered an internal review. Staff admitted there had been no warnings, no signs of depression or erratic behavior. Some speculated he had chosen the timing deliberately, waiting until public attention waned before taking his life. Others believed it was guilt finally catching up to him. For Hannah's family, the news was bittersweet. Some felt relief knowing he could never hurt anyone again. Others felt cheated, that he had escaped the decades of confinement that were supposed to be his punishment. Margaret, upon hearing of his death, reportedly whispered only one word: coward. In Cedarville, the case left scars that never fully healed. It became a cautionary tale, cited in local papers and town meetings. The story of how a predator disguised as a pastor infiltrated a family, manipulated trust, and destroyed lives. It was also a story of systemic failure. How had Caleb, with 2 prior convictions and a documented pattern of violence, been released to live freely among unsuspecting families? How had the parole system, the churches, and the community at large failed to see the danger? In the aftermath, state lawmakers revisited parole policies for violent offenders. Advocates argued for greater transparency, so communities would be aware when high-risk individuals were released. Churches across the region reviewed their vetting processes for volunteers and leaders, determined not to repeat Cedarville's mistake. But policy changes and reforms could not restore what had been lost. Hannah Lowell's story remained frozen in time. A young mother who decorated her home for Halloween, who prepared candy and costumes, who promised her son a night of joy, and who never returned. For Mason, the memories of his mother would come from photographs, from stories told by relatives, from faded costumes tucked away in boxes. For Elliot, every October brought a painful reminder of the life that might have been. For Margaret, every day was a reckoning with choices she never thought she had to question. The tragedy underscored an unsettling truth: evil does not always announce itself with threats or weapons. Sometimes it hides behind warm smiles, polite manners, and words of faith. Sometimes it lives across the street, eating dinner at your table, earning trust while quietly waiting for an opportunity. The disappearance and death of Hannah Lowell revealed not only the darkness of one man but also the fragility of the assumptions we build our lives on. The belief that we know the people around us, the belief that appearances reflect reality, the belief that trust is safe. In Cedarville, those illusions died with Hannah. And though the trial closed the case on paper, the shadows it cast remained long after the courthouse emptied and the headlines faded.